morning and welcome everyone. My name is Michael Summerton and this is our final INN8 webinar for 2025. In the business of strategy, the most expensive words you can utter are, "I didn't see that coming." They say that hindsight is 20/20, but our guest today has made a career out of ensuring his foresight is just as sharp. He is widely regarded as the authority on strategic planning in South Africa. He's the person you listen to when you need to know what is happening, but also why it's happening and what happens next. We are here to look around the corner. He doesn't need a crystal ball because he brings the data. He is one of the few voices who has consistently and accurately mapped out the high and low roads of our economic and political landscape, both in South Africa and abroad. He's advised some of the country's biggest boards and navigated some of the most complex political shifts in the last 2 decades. He challenges conventional wisdom, and he follows the data wherever it leads him. He's here to share some of that foresight with us. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Frans Cronje.
Michael, thank you very much for getting me in.
Brilliant, and thanks so much for joining us in Cape Town. I know you traveled down to be with us. A strategically significant area you just pointed out to me earlier. So we'll get a bit into that, Frans. But in terms of the webinar today, so we have extended the time a little bit. So we've gone to 90 minutes to make sure we get a full sort of 20 minutes of questions in. And also we get to spend a bit more time on some of the topics we're hoping to cover today. So let's dive right in. Frans, could you perhaps just check us in? I know that you spend time with clients both locally and internationally, and South Africa is part of a global ecosystem, and the past 12 months have certainly been interesting. Maybe just set the scene for us with what we're seeing happening in the US and global politics elsewhere.
Yeah, I think the most important single global trend is that, and let's tie it back to South Africa. When South Africa's democracy was born, we were in a unipolar world. The Soviet Union had collapsed. There wasn't enough sensible, I think, strategic thinking about China. And the sense became that the US had been all dominant and might remain so. And in a lot of the Western world, which has informed a lot of South African thinking and certainly business and investment thinking, there was a dominant idea, which was the idea of the end of history. And that idea essentially said that the collapse of the Soviet Union marked the ultimate triumph of the Western liberal order. And Western liberal ideas would now dominate around the world. They'd flow all around the place, and hence the history was over. And that had a great many implications. One was that hard power in politics and diplomacy might no longer be necessary, because we were all going to become sort of little Western liberal societies. We could talk to each other, find mutual common ground and understanding. And you had this dominant Western order. It certainly was a great influence on South Africa, because the ANC that had been driven into exile in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union realized that one of its key backers was no longer around, and it had to be circumspect in its actions, and that was very important. 30 years later, we're in a very different place. We're not a unipolar order anymore. We're a multipolar world. The end of history idea was wrong. It was not the ultimate triumph of the Western liberal order. Alternative systems of government and approaches to how the world should be governed have risen. There are very few examples now of, since the end of the Second World War, of a society that was very poor and then became completely free, like South Africa is, and then became very, very rich. The pattern has tended to be you were very poor, you fell under a slightly autocratic but perhaps enlightened authority, and then you became very, very prosperous. The idea that hard power shouldn't be central to politics and diplomacy has also fallen away, because there are these vying powers. And Trump certainly, I think, is the most stark example of this. The Trump administration realizes you need to bring hard power forward in diplomacy very fast in order to pursue your strategic interests. And the final point, which I'll sort of close the opening with for you, which takes us back to South Africa, is how do you exert power in a multi-polar world? You control choke points. And choke points are usually in the sea somewhere. They are points where naval, so military and commercial traffic are squeezed into a very narrow little band. And if you can command choke points, you can command the flow of force and therefore influence and the flow of commerce around the world. And South Africa, literally, if we looked out the window, we can almost see it. The naval base at Simonstown is one of the world's most important strategic choke points. And so the entire edifice of how we think about the world, the entire edifice of how balances of power are structured, and the entire place of South Africa within that order is fundamentally different today to where it was when we became a democracy in 1994.
So you could almost say that over the last 30 years, where global trade, integration, markets being as efficient as possible, and I suppose the Japanese version of just-in-time manufacturing, countries are increasingly thinking about what just in case and securing trade routes and strategic alliances. And so you mentioned tariffs previously. It's been a big theme this year. Perhaps we could just sort of pause there and say, and unpack the tariffs question a little bit.
Yeah, look, if you're a unipolar world, then these great global institutions and multilateralism, and we all get together through these forums, and that's the basis of this end of history idea. We will find mutual common ground and understanding through these forums. When you become a multi-polar order again, as we very certainly have, I mean, the world certainly has, then the room for bilateral engagements and so on becomes very, very great again. That will inform your strategy and how you pursue it and the like. Go to this question of tariffs and Mr. Trump. First point I'll make for you, I don't think Trump is a tariff guy at all. I don't think that there is really a very deep view in the administration that tariffs make complete economic sense. Rather, I think something else occurred, or there's a degree of that view, but I think something else was dominant. If the end of history idea is wrong, if you need to bring force back into foreign relations, or at least the threat of it, in pursuing your interests, you need leverage. Mm-hmm. Now, what might that be? There are many things. You can use the dollar as the reserve currency. We can talk about that a bit later, whether that remains the case. You can send troops around the world and position them and use them as leverage. And I think something we'll get into as well is I think Trump is one of the he's a complex individual, but he's also a peacemaker. And this was not an option. These forever wars that Americans have got sucked into over the last 50 years. And that tariffs were picked because they offered the prospect of leverage, and they were force. So you brought force forward in your diplomatic relations very quickly. You threatened someone with a punitive tariff regime. That was essentially your opening bid. Mm. And from that point, the negotiation could happen. And I think that appears to be very much the nature of the man. I think the tariff regime, we're past peak tariff now. I think, firstly, it's had the effect that he wished for it to have in many respects. That there's some few outposts remaining. South Africa's one that's still got to sort its affairs out. But I think the most powerful force against tariffs now is domestically within the US, and in two respects. One is the tariffs are in front of the Supreme Court. And two lower courts have already found against important aspects of the tariff regime that it cannot stand. Now, those courts had liberal majorities, and the Supreme Court does not. But our sense is that the Supreme Court is also going to find against key aspects of the tariff regime. That is important because price pressures on households now stand as the single most important political issue inside the United States. A few weeks ago, the new Trump administration went through the first sort of phase of elections since he became president. And the Republicans had a very hard time of it. In Tennessee today, around Memphis, there's an important special election. Now that's around what you might have called, if you were an American, a ruby red seat. And there is now a prospect that that seat could be flipped and go blue, so fall out of Republican hands. And this is in Memphis. And the candidate challenging the Republican dominance is actually quite a left-leaning Democrat. And there's a very acute awareness that domestic price pressures are now a key vulnerability within the Trump administration. And in as far as tariffs have introduced those, and they necessarily must, because you're increasing the friction of doing business, I think there is a serious. My call for you. I'm very good on insisting that people in my position mustn't sit on the fence. You must make a call. You must live with the consequences, and sometimes you will be wrong. But I think we're going to see the tariff regime cool over the next through 2026, and with some exceptions. And that tariffs will have served in the main their purpose, and that between the Supreme Court, the purpose being served, and their great importance ahead of the US's next midterm elections, we're probably well past peak tariff now.
So a vital point that you mentioned was when something is going to affect a politician's popularity, they tend to respond to those. And we'll pick up on some of those locally a bit later. Before we get to the choke points, let's just touch on, there's been a lot of diplomacy that came out of the Trump administration in the Middle East, and I mean, you're alluding to some of the activity in Europe, where I guess we're surprised that wars happen, but actually human history is largely violent conflict populated by brief bouts of peace. And so how do you see that playing out in the Middle East and Europe in the next 18 months?
When Trump was coming to power for the second time, our advice to clients was he will end the war in the Middle East and he will end the war in Europe. And I think he has in the main ended the first one. That started in his first term with the Abraham Accords, which really saw Israel in a very close alliance with much of the Arab world, cast against what Israel and its Arab allies would see as the threat of Iran. And now the hot war in Gaza has essentially been brought to an end. Hamas is gravely weakened. Hezbollah is gravely weakened. Assad in Syria is gone. The Iranians have been knocked back a while on their nuclear ambitions, which I think is the objective. Was the objective? The objective was not to remove the regime in Tehran, for the reason that, as American experience in the Middle East shows over the last 30 years, if you remove a regime, you have no idea what's coming in its place.
Yes.
So the idea of leaving the Iranians in power, I think, has some support, but not with too close access to a nuclear weapon. So I think the Middle East is, I think the Abraham Accord idea will be the dominant force on the Middle East for the next, let's say, decade or so, which means that in the relative order of things, and it's always relative, the Middle East is probably going to enter a period of relative peace and stability. The war in Europe is also at an end. It was an absurd conflict that should perhaps never have arisen in the first place. I've always, again, in the relative sense, had somewhat more of not sympathetic, because it's a terrible thing, but an understanding of the Russian position, and that Russia did feel aggrieved that NATO's assurances that there would be no eastward expansion after the collapse of the Berlin Wall had not always been held to in the West. The sides have fought each other to a standstill. The standstill is very close to a line that approximates that of the old Minsk Accords. And the Minsk Accords would have, in a sense, partitioned Ukraine, but left the eastern half, which is ethnically quite close to the Russians, under Kiev's control. And the fighting has now ended on essentially that line. If you look at maps of the Ukraine, political maps of how Ukrainians vote, they are stark. 2/3, the side on the left, on the west of Ukraine, kind of votes for more Western-leaning types of people. The third in the east, which has been the subject of this terrible fighting and slaughter, leans more towards Russia. So this partition makes a lot of sense. It's very much in the West's interest to do this because I think Western strategists perceive China as a threat. And Russia stands between China and the West, physically. And doing great damage to Russia, placing its politics and its economy under great pressure, might induce a driving it into a Chinese orbit ultimately. And again, the warning on Tehran, do not change a government. We'll talk about that in South Africa now too. Do not change a government if you do not know what you're going to replace it with. And Russia so it makes sense to the West. I think Western thinking is shifting to let's actually turn Russia into an ally, not an adversary. And Russia's relationship with China is also very difficult. The Chinese have claims on Russian territory. I think Russia feels threatened by China in many respects. So the big calls are the Middle East enters a period of relative stability built around the idea of the Abraham Accords. The war in Europe ends, and slowly over time, these things take a bit of time, an effort is made to draw Russia into more the Western orbit and use it as a bulwark against Chinese sort of, you might think of it, expansion in the very much broader sense of the word, into Europe and into the West.
There's a strategic choke point in the Middle East, which the Houthis are causing trouble and difficult to control. And then there's a second one in the Solomon Islands. Yeah. And then the South Atlantic is kind of where we find ourselves as South Africa. So maybe let's just touch on those briefly and how you see the Chinese expansion sort of proceeding and why some of that happens.
So we're in this multipolar world. We have all these kind of powers that can project influence. Iranians a little bit and the Russians a little bit and India is becoming so important. But in that multipolar world, the two very powerful sort of partners, it almost makes it a sort of bilateral arrangement. And that's the great struggle between China and the West. Now, South Africa is important in that. And this is an argument we make a lot, and because we deeply believe that this is the case. In that, I've said to you that in this multipolar world, you control choke points and you control influence. And just a comment on that. How do you, in the multipolar world, how do you control something like the Indo-Pacific? You patrol it with a ship. You need thousands of ships. It's impossible. Do you deploy troops to every island and kind of hold them? No, it's just logistically you can't do it. So you want to hold the choke point, the little narrow gateway where things enter and exit. Now the Indo-Pacific is the region of the Indian Ocean, so off our east coast, that extends all the way through Australia and into the bottom half of the Pacific. Inside that region moves more than half of all global trade that travels by sea, and still the majority of China's oil. So if you have some influence around that, you're very important. The Indo-Pacific is controlled by 3 points on the map, and I'll make it's a little bit extreme, but I'll make the argument for you it is only those 3. One of them is Simonstown, because that's the gateway between the South Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific. And a young analyst who wrote a very good paper for this for me explained that you can't just sail miles to the south because the sea is too difficult. There's ice and things. The shipping is actually squeezed into a very narrow band off the Cape Coast. If you move up from that a few thousand miles, you get to the gateway to the Red Sea, and that's commanded by something called the Bab al-Mandab Strait. And it narrows to a very narrow little passage. And the Americans used to have a naval facility at the gateway through the strait at Djibouti. And then after they'd had that for a while, the Chinese got one as well. And so American dominance, or Western dominance at the gateway began to be eroded. And then from Yemen, sort of across the way, sort of across the road literally, an effort was made to disrupt shipping. There's probably an Iranian-backed effort and a lot of reasons for that. But efforts to, and that's driven by a group called the Houthis, but efforts to rein in the Houthis have failed. To bomb them from the air and disable them hasn't worked. And the Houthis have been so effective in disrupting shipping through that strait that the volume of ships passing through the Suez Canal over the last 2 to 3 years is significantly down from what it was before. And those ships have had to go somewhere. Trade didn't stop, so they went around the Cape. So Western dominance is challenged at this choke point. If you then go east, across the vast expanse of the Indian Ocean, you go all the way past Australia. Off the east coast of Australia are islands called the Solomon Islands. And after the Japanese had sunk the American fleet at Pearl Harbor in 1941, the Japanese seized the Solomon Islands. And the reason they did that is if you do that, you cut Australia and Southeast Asia off from the protection of the American Navy. Very brilliant Chinese diplomacy of the past decade, and more than that, has put China in a position where it may be able to operate its naval vessels from the Solomon Islands. And in fact, if you superimpose Chinese sort of moves in Southeast Asia on top of what Japan did after Pearl Harbor, you see that the two maps, it's a facsimile of the strategy. And it's very important, this, because American containment doctrine in the Pacific, so that originated after the Second World War. The Soviet Union was dominant. We're in this bipolar world. And the Americans like to think of the Pacific as America's lake. But the Soviets could get into the Pacific, and so something had to be done about that. And a chap called John Foster Dulles, who is Dulles Airport in Washington. If you fly to Washington, you land at Dulles. He conceived an idea called the island chain strategy, which is that a series of islands sort of through the Korean Peninsula and through Japan and so on, interspersed with American naval facilities, would contain the Soviets. They wouldn't be able to get into the Pacific. And some of the thinking was, as the Soviet Union collapsed and there's the rise of China, well, we can do the same thing. We'll use the island chains, we contain China. But Solomon is east of the island chains, which means that you can operate outside of the containment zone, and therefore the Pacific is up for grabs. If you can, why it's justified to spend so much time on the story and a discussion about South Africa is if you command all 3 points, Solomon, the something off the Bab al-Mandab Strait, and Simonstown, you control the Indo-Pacific. And dominance in the Indo-Pacific will be extremely important in determining the balance of power between the West and China over the next 20 to 30 years. And if you lose all 3 points, you have a real problem. And South Africa has one of those. And I'm happy to make the argument, just to make the point, but you can debate whether it's entirely so, that South Africa's strategic position, its geostrategic real estate, is arguably the most valuable asset the country has today. And if our, it's not just the diplomats who work for the state, but broadly, if we could cast ourselves in these terms, we could use the trading of that real estate to attract vast trade and investment concessions from Washington and Beijing alike. We'll get to this still, I'm sure, but if we're asked what would you watch to know that South Africa worked, we'd say the fixed investment rate. So that's gross fixed capital formation as a share of GDP. And the current number on South Africa is 15%, which is very low. Emerging market our big emerging market competitors do twice that. And at 15%, our fixed investment rate is consistent with the idea of the economy growing at 1%. If we want to grow the economy at, let's say, 2.5 or 3%, we need a fixed investment rate of 20%. Mm-hmm. And if our fixed investment rate goes to 25%, our economy will grow at 4%, and then many wonderful things will happen to us. And some of our critics say, well, okay, how do you do that? Where will you get all this from? So some of it is money within the country. But, at whatever it is today, 17 to 1 or thereabouts, the dollar goes a very long way. And if we can trade the geostrategic real estate for trade and investment concessions, we can, through literally 1 or 2 big diplomatic transactions, close that gap and go from 15 to 20%. And therefore, in a conversation about South Africa's future and how to think about it, it is justified to spend such a lot of time at the beginning of a discussion talking about a multipolar global order, the Indo-Pacific, and how important it is. My last comment on that, we've now been in the Pacific, so on the east coast, but off the west coast is the South Atlantic. The Trump talks a lot about Greenland, and he talks a lot about Panama, and the reason he does that, there's good reason for it. His administration is of the view that if control is lost, America's rivals could enter the Atlantic through both and challenge its dominance in very much the same way. But in the same breath as Greenland and Panama is Simonstown, which is the back door into the Atlantic. The Chinese had once aspired to reaching the Atlantic through the Mediterranean, and they made some progress towards that until the sort of game was up, as it were, and they found it much harder going of late. And to reach the Atlantic, which you absolutely have to do, you now have to come down Africa's east coast, and you have to round the Cape. And then you have an access point into the Atlantic. Mrs. Thatcher sent her battle group to take back the Falklands Islands, not because of national pride, but because it's strategically so very, very important to do so. If you think like, let's say, an American strategist, and you say, what happens in a world where, and you mustn't misconstrue I'm quite open to Russia, and I think China offers South Africa immense advantages that we must take full advantage of. And our foreign policy should be entirely based on national interest, and excellent relations with China are part of that. But if you think from an American perspective, what happens if you can park a Chinese submarine off Africa's east coast? Mm. The next stop is New York. Yeah. It's a profoundly important thing that would happen. And South Africa literally has within its grasp the ability to play these kinds of geostrategic sort of games, but they're very serious, to its great advantage, and thereby to close its fixed investment gap, thereby to raise its rate of economic growth.
So that all makes complete sense. And I guess we've got this wonderful opportunity on the table as a country. The average everyday citizen might be forgiven when they look at the news flow, or even sort of scratch a bit deeper and look at some of the underlying policy making and diplomacy efforts from our government and other interested parties. And so it's almost like we're transmitting on 2 different wavelengths, or multiple wavelengths sometimes. And so I guess where to from here in terms of that opportunity, and how, what are some of the things which we could be looking for from South Africa to sort of grasp that?
Well, let's make the case for the place, and then see where we are with that. If you let's just get the context right, because we're so focused on the immediacy of it that go back. In May of last year, the ANC loses an election, we form a unity government. Now that was very important, because up until that point, literally for the previous 400 years, if you lived within the territory that is the modern South African state, one powerful actor, democratic or otherwise, made the rules, wherever you lived in the country. And through that whole, let's say the modern South Africa is 400 years old, one actor decided how it was. And suddenly, after the May election, that wasn't true anymore. And two had to come together. They had to form a government, and they had to decide what to do, and the one couldn't move against the other. And I mean, this just changes the strategic balance to such a profound extent that the implications are actually very difficult to fathom. So that's what happened. Now, what's the case for South Africa? Let's think of it as a hand of cards that we've been dealt. First card, I'll tell you, we can get into the detail of it if you want the substantiation, is South Africa's democracy works extremely well. We became a democracy so that if we weren't well governed, people would be able to do something about that. And that's essentially what 94 was about. And through our first 15 years, the ANC governed the country quite well in many respects. The number of people with jobs had doubled, living standards improved very rapidly. When the ANC came to power, 49% of families didn't have electricity in their homes. By the time Thabo Mbeki packed up his desk, that number was under 20%. So, and I can quote this stuff. I've been told I'm better at this stuff than Mac Maharaj was when he was Jacob Zuma's spokesperson. And as a consequence, the ANC's vote share lifted. In 2004, it was 6 percentage points stronger than when Mandela had led it and the country to liberation. And growth was up and fixed investment was up. And so it was rewarded. In the subsequent period to today, in real terms, South Africa's people have become a bit poorer. Whereas we doubled the number of people in employment, creating 7.5 million jobs between 94 and 2008. Since 2008, we've created 2 million net new jobs. The share of families living in a shack that had been rapidly eroding has gently lifted over the period. As living standards stagnated, we saw a commensurate increase in levels of protest action. So the share of all protests, and if you measure the intensity of protests, you measure the share of protests that are violent, and that had bottomed out at 6% under Mbeki, and it has gone back to 30%. And the protests were important because they were ANC voters who were very pleased at what had been delivered to them after 94 in many respects. Saying to the administration, look here, this isn't what it used to be. We were on such an upward trajectory and now it's stagnating. And in a fatal miscalculation, the protests aren't read as what they are, a friendly warning, as it were. And I can remember a police commissioner foolishly stating that we will not tolerate this kind of disorder in society and we'll crack down on this, which was, if you want the milestone, you go and Google it. The milestone on showing you what was going to happen happened in Vicksburg in the Free State when a chap called Andries Tatane was shot dead by a policeman during a protest and broadcast on the SABC. And I can remember watching that with some analyst colleagues and thinking, what is this? Do they not see what they are going to create? And so the protests reached a peak point, and certainly at the end of COVID in Natal, we reached like sort of the high watermark. And in any society, change occurs along the lines of least resistance. And therefore, free societies like South Africa do not go through violent revolutions because it's much more difficult to change a country by picking up a rifle, shooting people in the streets. And so once the protest curve was ignored for what it meant and living standards continued to stagnate, people did the next easiest thing. They voted differently. The ANC lost an election. That's all that happened last year. And they voted that way because voter behavior in South Africa is driven by the material circumstances of people, not by ideology, not by radical ideas. I've been involved in polling on South Africa for 20 years. I've polled it intensely for the last 3 or 4 years. Public opinion is completely pragmatic, centrist, and wholly sensible. It's a wonderful asset. So one, the democracy works. Secondly, people are pragmatic and centrist and sensible. Now, lots of parts of the world we might talk about, that's not the case. And it's very difficult to solve the problem if opinion is radicalized. The Western world is deeply radicalized between these hard left and hard right blocks. It hasn't happened in South Africa. So your democracy works to change the country peacefully. Don't take that for granted. It's a vast thing. Secondly, people are completely sensible. Go to fiscal policy. If the ANC knew they were going to lose the election last year, I know they knew. And what they should have done, if they were going to be a cliche, a post-colonial government that had been housed in exile in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. It's obvious what you do. You have to print money. Because if you can print a lot of money, you can create inflation. And if you create inflation, you'll create desperate poverty. And then you can create populism, and then the election result doesn't really matter because you can do whatever you want.
Yeah.
And they know, I assure you, they know this very well. They were schooled in it. They are very expert, and they didn't do it. And instead, they accepted the loss. They knew the loss was coming. And they accepted it. And then they could have gone to do, they could have done what, they could have done deal with MK and the EFF. It was entirely in their power. And no one could have stopped them. And they didn't. So it was the twin thing. They didn't print. Fiscal prudence remained. And then they went and did a deal with Helen Ziller and the DA out of their free will and free choice. So the democracy works. We're pragmatic, fiscal restraint. I mean, I know that the debt to GDP is 3 times what it was in 2008, and the deficit's a multiple of the growth rate, but the minister has tried very hard to put downward pressure on both under very trying political circumstances. Then, so we've got 3 cards. Four
shared values.
You always, okay, good. So we got 4. That's right. I lose count of them because they're actually quite a few. Then we go to electricity. So we could use these cards and we could say, look, the place is chiefly democratic and changed peacefully and people are sensible. And someone might say to us, yeah, that's great, but electricity is a hard ceiling on the growth rate. If you can't get the growth rate up, you can't improve material circumstances of people, the GNU is in danger. That's no longer true for SA. Our economy produces at the peak hour of a peak day about 25,000 megawatts of electricity. But we have installed nearer 50,000 of coal. Eskom's engineers, who are the right people to ask, who've run those plants, say that if they were refurbished, they would work again. Those plants are already connected to the grid, and there is surplus grid capacity running from the north of the country to the south, so from the coal fields into the cities. There isn't any surplus capacity running in a west to east band, from where the wind blows in the east to where the sun shines most in the west, which is a powerful warning on thinking that we have an immediate avenue towards an energy solution through wind and solar. And I just want to qualify that in a moment. If we refurbished a third of the coal capacity and we ran that at 70% of its capacity, we would add 10,000 megawatts to the grid. Our estimates are that if the South African economy, just from an energy perspective, wishes to ramp up the growth rate through the next decade from the current 1% to 2 to 3 to 4 and then to 5, we need 10,000 megawatts added to peak daily production. So our argument is we can already do that with power stations that already exist. You just need to refit them. It doesn't take too long. It's not very expensive. In the sense of trying to build a new nuclear fleet, it's already connected to the grid. With coal, we already have. So there is a solution. The next step of it is, of course, what about carbon neutral and all of that. And I think coal is very dirty. If you drive around in Mpumalanga, you see the consequences. So that's not the argument. The argument is the order of things and timing. We've got this young democratic government that needs to get the growth rate up, so it needs electricity to do that. If it doesn't do that, get the growth rate up quickly, it is at risk of seeing what happened to the ANC happen to it when material circumstances didn't improve. Give South Africa a break, therefore, and say to it, right, we understand you've got this amazing experiment in democracy, this multi-party It's coalition. It's a coalition between the ANC and the DA. You've got this stuff, run it for a decade in order to get your growth rate up, and then on your own terms, build and invest in whatever cleaner energy technologies there are. So the point is simply that we don't actually have to have a hard electricity imposed ceiling on the rate of growth. And our environmental problem is 20 million unemployed people before it, and there are tough choices to make. And I think the correct choice to make is to burn the coal in order to reduce that 20 million number. Because it's not just their living standards that hinge on that, it's the very future of the country's democracy. And then we have Simonstown. Now this list, I'll forget how many we're at. Let's say we're at 5 or 6. The point is simply this, that if this is the hand you are given, how hard is it really to play it in a way that you become a very successful society? It's not actually that difficult at all. And that's a point I like to emphasize, that fixing South Africa and getting it right is not actually that hard anymore. We could, with some straightforward, simple decisions, actually get there in short order and with the support of the great majority of people in the country.
Sure, thanks, Frans. So if we just get back to the GNU, 18 months in, we've, for those of us who've had children, at 18 months, you sort of question your decisions, but you also realize that you have them for life. And while you don't necessarily have a GNU for life, our 18-month-old toddler might be heading for terrible twos at some point. There have been almost monthly concerns since the beginning. Will it break up? Will it won't? And let's just touch on sort of the recursive nature and the natural controls that we have, which encourage us back to the table each time. And you mentioned the VAT when we were talking earlier.
I think the strongest one that I saw for the first time is about 100 or 150 days before the 2024 election. We put a poll question to voters, and we said the DA and the ANC both have some good people and some good policies. And if they could work together, that might be the solution. And a very strong majority of South Africans said they agree with that. Now, that was before the ANC had lost. And when a popular wisdom was that the DA and the ANC working together is just not a thing. They hate each other, their opponents, their voters are entirely opponents to each other. And so it's a silly idea. And obviously it's MK and the EFF and the ANC. That's held true since when we polled in November. Strong majorities of DA and ANC voters like the GNU and what it's doing. They have confidence in it. And the politicians know this. And if you were to be the one that triggered the breakup of the GNU, you will pay a very heavy political price for that today. And that's important, and that is understood. So you can get fed up with your colleague, but you might try and goad your colleague into you break it up. But are you going to pull the trigger on that yourself? No one's going to do that at this time. A second thing that followed from that struck me was that on the day of the election last year, the DA got most of its votes from established, let's say, multi-generational suburbia, black and white. That didn't matter. The marker, whether you vote for the DA, is now, if you're second generation middle class suburban, I'll say you voted for the DA, didn't you? The ANC got a big chunk of its votes from traditional rural communities. And its strategists, in thinking about the implication, they got about 40%. The DA got more than half from established suburbia. And thinking about that, they came to two realizations. One is this is a very old market. These are older people. And the size of this market is eroding at the mortality and migration rate. So are we going to kind of pitch our future on, we'll double down on that market? You're going to get slayed. The market's going to get smaller. The ANC got 40% of its votes also from the aspirant middle class on the fringe of the cities. So people who are not in the multi-generational middle class, but certainly aspire to. And that's a growing market. And so and that market is not unrelated to the rural market, because older rural people have seen youngsters leave and go to the cities, so they're invested in the success of those youngsters in cities. Because if they can become middle class, then everything gets better for everyone through the whole chain, back to the grandparents, great-grandparents, whatever. And so the argument is this then, that the DA and the ANC have a lot in common in who their voters are, because policies that ensure a future for the established middle class are virtually the same ones that create a future for the emerging middle class. And therefore we're in the fortuitous circumstances where the partners to the coalition receive their votes from people who have virtually identical interests. And the idea, therefore, that these are two alien markets and deeply hostile to each other, and the purpose of policy making must to trade off the one's interest against the other, that's false. Now, if you take the first point I made to you, that people, before it had happened, when they were still told it couldn't, they liked the idea. They have continued to like the idea. And the deep root of the relationship is two blocks of voters that have, let's not sit on the fence, almost identical policy interests. This GNU is pretty solid. Now, in the ordinary course of things, people can get fed up with each other, and they can argue, and they can disagree. And I don't think that's bad initially. The biggest argument was around VAT earlier this year. And we had some clients that said to us, this is the end, isn't it? And it's all over. And we said, well, maybe, but we don't think so. We think it's actually quite good what's happened, because it's so new. Remember the 400 years of one side calling the shots and the others going along with it. What was happening in the VAT debate is the ANC was testing the limits of its power. As some of its critics at the time said to it, you're now a 39% party. Didn't round up to the 40. And the DA, which had never had power, real power, and they learned to exercise this. And that was a very good thing. If you've played rugby, I think you'll understand this better perhaps than some other things. You kind of push each other around a bit to see. We saw against Wales on Saturday night at the end. But everyone was able to have a beer afterwards in the change rooms, I'm sure. So they're still testing the limits of each other's powers. Go a step beyond that. Now, what can break this up now? You can get into a conflict. We're going to have an election about a year from now, local government election. Will be very tense. These guys have to go up against each other. The ANC must pick a new leader. The DA is perhaps going to pick a new leader before the ANC does. But that person could change the trajectory. So absolutely the thing could break up. If it does, what are the alternatives? One is that the ANC goes to the EFF and MK. This could happen. I think it's unlikely, but it could. If that happened, there's an immediate shock. The rand will lose some ground, and the bond market will lose some ground, and confidence will fall, and fixed investment and living standards will deteriorate.
So there's a significant consequence.
A significant consequence. But what happens when living standards deteriorate in South Africa? Well, when it happened after 2008, the ANC lost an election. And if I was to advise them, I would say, if you go this way, the DA is going to tell you, good luck, chaps. See you in 2029. Let's see what happens. And we can get into Johannesburg and so on in a moment. So I think even if you go to that radical extreme, given where I've told you public opinion is, you are simply going to feed the centrist political interest even further. So it's not a sure way out of trouble for the ANC. And I think one of the reasons the ANC didn't do the deal with MK and the EFF is this very understanding. That the only reason they lost is that they were entertaining ideas like expropriation and national health insurance in the election cycle before they lost 17 percentage points. Whereas when the economy was growing at 5%, between 2000 and, well, eventually 2004 and 7, but 4% in that cycle to the 2004 election, the ANC in the decade from 94 to 2004 gained 6 percentage points. There's a lesson in this. Populism burns you politically. If let's say it breaks up for another reason, they get fed up with each other, or all these things can happen. At the next election horizon, there will be a new inflection point to negotiate this transaction again. The local government election a year from now, there are more than 200 councils up for grabs. In very few of those is anyone going to get 50% of the vote. It's not going to be the case in Johannesburg. It's not going to be the case in most of the mid-level cities, or Sasolburg or Middelburg in the north of the country. And but collectively, the ANC and the DA are both going to, collectively will have over 50% in most of those places. So what are you going to do? Are you going to have 200 separate coalition negotiations? And not over unimportant places? Or might you, after the election, won't be before, might you say afterwards, listen here, let's do something where together we have over 50, we're going to take over. And let's just, to make it easy, if you've got more than we have, you are the mayor, and you call most of the shots. And where it's the other way around, we'll be the mayor and we'll call most of the shots. So I think the chances are very good that we're going to have several new inflection horizons over the next decade, where assembling a new form of unity government is able to take place.
Yeah. So one of the driving forces to take advantage of the opportunities ahead of us is some level of policy reform, or at least mitigating some of the worst parts of what's currently in draft or being proposed. And so to what extent do you see positive developments, like in the NHI, in the Bella, even BEE has been spoken about more recently?
Yeah, look, if you want to get ahead of the curve, you've got to have a little bit of courage. And the courage is to read small changes in the present conditions of a system. And that's just not sort of esoteric. I didn't make this stuff up. A lot of our methods are based on complex systems theory. And in complex systems theory, there's a principle called emergence. And emergence means that a small change in the present conditions of a system brings about a huge shift in its future circumstances. And it makes prediction and forecasting very difficult. So the example I might cite for you is traffic. Traffic is now seen as a complex system. And if you were to say on any given morning from one part of Cape Town to the other, how long will it take to get there? I got here early this morning because I wasn't. If one car, one actor in the system behaves in the wrong way and sort of blocks the Vaal Drive, then I would have been late for you, which wouldn't have been very good. And you can use that apparent weakness to your advantage by saying, are there small changes in the present? It's the butterfly effect applied to politics and economics. Are there small changes in the present conditions of systems that are important? A mentor of mine made the point that he called essentially the end of apartheid in either 1969 or 1970, when John Vorster agreed that the Springboks could play an all-black team that had a Maori in it. And at the time, the South African government said, a Maori, it's kind of grey area that, but they wanted to play rugby. And this chap said that was extremely important because it meant the Nats were not actually fully invested in the very foundational basis of their political system. And if you offer them something a little bit better, they will compromise. And he said they will compromise at every juncture, as they did, all the way to what happened in '94. I think the point there's a little bit of bringing out, so I'm just going to make one more example of it. Apparently, if you drive an oil tanker, it's very difficult to turn it around because it's got a lot of momentum, and you can't just turn the rudder because the forces are too great. So inside the rudder, there's a little rudder, and that rudder turns, and it turns a big rudder, and apparently this is called twin tabbing. And we use a similar principle. Are there little rudders turning from which we can learn a great deal? Now, I think there are a number. One is the very deal in the GNU itself. That tells you a lot, because there was an absolutely easy alternative. Just go with the EFF and the MK. Perfectly within your power to do so. We have the understanding that on national health insurance, which would in practice have nationalized the health industry, the dominant view in the administration now is to say to the private sector and to other interested parties, come up with something better, and we'll go with that. And that window has been opened. And that might be something like mandatory low-fee insurance for employed people. That's kind of national health insurance, and we carry on. And we preserve this amazing asset the country has in its cheap and world-class private healthcare. Last week in Parliament, the relevant minister said there would be a substantive review of BEE policy. Why do you review something that is fine? And BEE policy is not some sort of distant, sort of peripheral issue. It is the foundational South African policy, because it's the policy that is directed at addressing the past. That the administration is prepared to announce in Parliament that we will review this is probably the most significant policy announcement here in 30 years. And my understanding of it is completely sincere, and that there is a concern. It's not about abandoning transformations. That's nothing as dramatic as that. I'll share with you one concern. Does BEE serve as a tax on capital? And has that made South Africa less competitive? And does that help to explain the low fixed investment rate?
It's a very practical concern.
Does that need to be? And I think it's a correct concern. I think it has had that effect. And should that be set right? Our unemployment rate is 30+%. The world's rate is 5%. Can you win BEE points for creating employment and not in the main at all? And does that sort of thing need to be set right? So there's a little national health insurance move, which is significant. There's the BEE move, which is more significant than the rugby against the All Blacks 40 years ago. There's the deal with the DA. In the mini budget recently, which was so well received and triggered the first ratings upgrade in 2 decades, what I think was most significant in that budget was the introduction of the idea of a fiscal anchor. Now that would be a policy, even legislated, a rule that you can't borrow too much. Why that? I mean, if the ANC and the DA are both fairly fiscally prudent, why introduce that? Is it because there's a concern that it's not entirely certain who the next leader of the country might be? And you might wish to put in place a mechanism that will constrain the ability of whoever it is to do the wrong thing on borrowing. If you then go deep into the data, we polled in November. The DA came out a month or two ago and announced that we need a new framework for empowerment policy. And Thabo Mbeki had correctly and famously refused to debate Tony Leon when Mbeki was in charge and Leon ran the opposition. Because Mbeki, rightly, it was completely the right thing to do, said that if I debate him, people will think he and his party's ideas have merit. So we can't do that. And that was the right thing to do. After the DA announces its empowerment policy alternative, what is the response? Well, Mr. Ramaphosa said the right place to do this is in Parliament, to have this discussion. And this isn't a peripheral policy. The ANC spokesperson said, absolutely not. However, we are quite reasonable, so if you want to discuss it, we can sit down and talk about it. Within a month, there's the announcement in Parliament. In November, we polled the DA proposal. It was quite a prominent thing, so people were aware of it. And we said, do you support it or do you not support it? 61% of ANC voters said they support the DA proposal. The point of this is that the courage you need is you need to take these little things and you need to extrapolate them into where they might possibly be leading. And you must do that on the balance of the probabilities, and in my world you must make a call. I think that's and I would say to you at the moment the call on the cold facts of the thing are that a vastly important reform window is opening for the country that can be taken advantage of. The ANC will not on its own do this, because it's very difficult inside the party. It's factions and all sorts of terrible things. You can't really stand up at a meeting of the party's executive committee and say, well, I believe we shouldn't have national health insurance. Your career might be cut short for reasons that have nothing to do with national health insurance. Your factional adversaries. But the opportunity, this is the critical thing. Business and other interested parties must not stand back now and wait for the government to move on health insurance or on empowerment or on any of these questions. They must step, the quagmire between ourselves and the Americans, another example. Don't wait and see what does the foreign minister do. Step into this opportunity and say we have a plan, a proposal, and write it from, have some political sense in it. Mandatory health cover, very, very appealing. I can tell you COSATU will support that very strongly. Step into that, say these are the alternatives, this is what we can do, and then we can break the deadlock on policy. But we will not break the deadlock in policy if people of influence stand back now and are shy and wait for the government to move first. Mr. Ramaphosa is a person who will split the difference on things. If the climate is good on reform, he will move in the direction that it's moving. It is always like this. There go the people, and as their leader, we will follow them. Is how you do this sort of thing. So it is the most important thing in the world now that these windows that have been opened are read for what they really are. The minister didn't have nothing else to say last week in Parliament and winged it on empowerment and misspoke. It's an absolute intentional strategy to create an opportunity to say let's do things better. But behind that, I just want to solidify the point a bit. I think there is a generation of younger politicians around who realize the old guard will retire, whether it's the blue guard or the green guard or whatever it is. And these guys are going to inherit the consequences. And they want careers and they want futures. And at this time, I would say the balance of those buy into the idea that if we can't raise a simple concept, if we can't raise the fixed investment rate, we'll never get the growth, we'll never command the confidence of the public. And then all sorts of other things can begin to happen. So, if it sounds, people say to me, you sound as if as if you might be optimistic. And I've never liked those terms, optimistic and pessimistic. I think you must go back to a cold, hard read and the twin tabbing concept, and you must be prepared to make a call. And the call on the balance of probabilities now is that from here we can solve the problem.
Okay, so before we get into questions, and sure that our time is evaporating in front of us, let's just, and speaking of running towards fires and stepping into the breach and being brave, let's just touch on Johannesburg, and you mentioned Helen Zille and her role that she might have in the future. Is Johannesburg salvageable? Is it a death spiral like Detroit, or what might happen there?
I think it's significant that she's gone to Johannesburg. It's again not because there was nothing else to do. Um, the DA and the ANC have these dominant markets for them. The ANC is the aspirant middle class. The DA is the established middle class. Gauteng is where those two tides overlap with each other. And Johannesburg is the centerpiece of Gauteng. And if whoever makes the greatest inroads there now stands to command the balance of political power in the election in 2029. And so Mrs. Zille has gone to occupy what is the most important political stage in the country that will define its near-term future. She is in her 70s, but I think is fond of saying that Zille women tend to live to be 100. And so, she's only getting going. Her personality, let's call it that, which many analysts have often thought to be a liability for the DA. I mean, she is forthright. In Johannesburg is becoming an asset. And because she's hard. And the hierarchy of needs in Gauteng has shifted to where people are frustrated at their standards of living. There's not always the water you would expect in a world-class city. And so they start to think, well maybe a really kind of hard-line person is what we need here. And I've been struck by how some of the DA messaging on Johannesburg has been literally verbatim. You don't have to like me, and you don't have to like the DA. You just have to want the place to come right. Mm. Johannesburg spends less on capex as a share of revenue than every other city. To get it right, the first thing you have to do is balance the books. The second thing you have to do is you have to get the capex spend right. And the third thing you have to do is you have to employ capable people. If you do those three things in that kind of order, you will necessarily bring about an improvement in the circumstances of the place. And in any political thing, you don't have to solve the problem. You have to indicate that the problem is being solved, and you will be cheered to the end of whatever it is that you're busy with. So I'm completely confident that somewhere like Johannesburg can be set right in short order if those decisions are taken. The DA is polling ahead of the ANC now in Gauteng. I asked a poll question in November of do you support the candidacy of Mrs. Zille in Johannesburg, which is a different question to are you going to vote for her? Mm. So these are different things. It's as my sort of great polling guru who does everything, Gareth van Onselen says, it's like saying, do you like flowers? And you might eventually, when you realize it's a serious question, say, yeah, but do you buy them? It's different. But on the question of do you like flowers, a majority of ANC voters in November, majority said they support Zille's candidacy in Johannesburg. So that's a little sign of where things are going. So it's extremely important. And if she makes inroads there, it sets up 2029. And I think that's the way to understand what's happening in Johannesburg now, is how does it set the table for the 2029 election and the coalition negotiations that will follow in the aftermath of that.
Okay, a significant seat of power. Okay, just touching on a couple of the questions, and there's quite a few just around the succession planning within the ANC and perhaps some of the very differing viewpoints within the 100-seater National Executive Council, and what are some of the options, short to medium term, and then we have to get a new head of state, and how does that progress?
I think I think Mr. Ramaphosa is in it until the end of 2027, and unless I've been very well misled, which is always possible, I suppose. I think he's in it until then. That's when his term naturally expires. The most popular candidate in the country to succeed him is Patrice Motsepe, who has, I think, 23% of the sort of interest of South Africans. Behind Mr. Motsepe, I think, is Fikile Mbalula, who's got about 19%, and then a couple of others. So it's very splintered. That's very dangerous for the ANC, because if they have a contested race for their 2027, and support is split, in 20 here and 20 there and 10 there, they could easily splinter. This is actually a very dangerous thing that can happen to the country, is because if the ANC splinters, and let's say its support drops from 40% to 20%, we have a disaster, because we no longer have two partners with which to form a government. And I know last year, before the election, a lot of people came past, the office, as it were, and said, how do we defeat the ANC? And the first things we said to them is well, it's perfectly doable, but with what do you intend to replace it? And very often they said, well, they don't know, but it's a terrible organisation, so get rid of it. And we said, you really have no business in involving yourselves or your money in politics if that's your attitude. It's extremely dangerous. And for the GNU to hold, the most important thing actually is that there are two partners that collectively command 55 to 60% of the vote. And let's say the ANC splinters and goes to 20, then we could have a real problem in how to fix things. So what the ANC will need to do, what it should do, what it needs to do, is it needs to unite behind, if you want a positive indicator, we're uniting behind a single candidate ahead of the election of our next leader. And it's an uncontested slate, and that person continues. So Mr. Motsepe is the popular candidate by quite a margin in these things. Mr. Mashatile is deputy president. He's well positioned in the line of succession. The conventional wisdom is that he'll jump straight into bed with MK and the EFF. I don't think that follows necessarily. I think if the reception to Mr. Mashatile from business, I think if the reception from the diplomatic community, and I think if the reception from the DA is shrewd. Politics is the art of the possible here. Your principles are important, but then I think I would say to you, he'll stay in the GNU as well. Fikile Mbalula, he's also, to a degree, perhaps in the running. I think he's someone who will stay in the GNU as well. But it is too early to say. And we've always been able to answer this question. So someone say, who's the next leader of the ANC? We could say. We even did Jacob Zuma long before that was popular. It was an unpopular thing to say. And this time, the significant point is actually, if you said to me, so who's it going to be? If that was your follow-up question, I'd say to you, I don't know. But it's the first time in all these cycles of ANC leadership that we've given that answer. And there is a risk in that. And the risk is that the ANC is vulnerable to splintering. And if it splinters to a very great extent, then it's difficult to build a unity government. And so perhaps the somewhat counterintuitive thing to some people is that an essential part of South Africa's success now is to shore up the ANC as much as any other actor to make sure that coalition options remain viable.
Okay, quite a few questions about large corporates holding on to cash on their balance sheets, some certainly looking north in terms of the African story and the African growth. What role does South Africa have to play in this, let's call it a long-term trend of Africa rising? Because it doesn't happen overnight. But if you go back 30 years, the material circumstances of millions of people around the continent have improved substantially. And that's due to any number of factors. South Africa maybe has missed out on some of that benefit, but how can we participate and why is it important for us as a country?
Look, I think Africa is rising. I mean, it's sometimes popular to say now that it's not, because it's been rising for 40 years. But it has been rising for 40 years. Again, go back to the You know, data, I've got a frustration sometimes about the industry that I'm a part of. Because if you want to do this kind of work, you need the data to understand. If you don't have the data, it's very much like you trying to advise your clients, and you've never seen where the currency is at, or what the inflation rate is, or what the stock market's at. And you're telling people blithely what to do. If people aren't lacing their advice to you with a lot of numbers in this sort of geostrategic political world, be deeply skeptical, because they're just talking nonsense. Africa's long-term trends are, in the first 2 decades after the end of colonial rule, I think Africa suffered north of 200 coups and assassinations of heads of state. In the last 2 decades, there have been very few of those relative to what was. And even the dictators now pretend to hold elections, and they cheat in them. That's very important.
Performative democracy.
Well, it means that you realize that you're much more democratic when you pretend to have an election than when you realize you didn't have to because no one cared. The number of years an African person spends in school is up year after year after year over the period of 40 years. The number of megawatts of electricity generated on the continent is way up. I think about 10 years ago, the number of trade dollars overtook the number of aid dollars entering the continent. That was a very important milestone. The strongest soundbite on Africa, it impresses people, is that it now has more cities of 1 million inhabitants than Europe and America combined. And those cities are in the world's fastest growing economies outside of India. And if you project from that, how many urban Africans can spend X number of dollars a day buying something, do that over 20 or 30 years, and Africa stands as a consumer market that starts to sort of eclipse the size of South America and the like. So, and you definitely want to be there. African people are also going to send 50 delegates to global fora, such as the UN, where they will decide on things. It's the largest single concentration of such support. So if you're the US and China, you definitely want to have some influence over those decisions. The untapped African agricultural potential is the solution to the global protein crisis. And intentionally we haven't said critical minerals, because that's massive, but it's also the cliche. Now, South Africa is another sort of cliche. South Africa's lost its opportunity to be the gateway. I don't think that's true yet. If you're a Western firm, it's very difficult to invest in if you're an American, you're subject to something called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which means that if you behave at all improperly, you can be prosecuted in the United States. If you have a cobalt mine in the heart of Africa, you're very likely going to end up with a child laborer somewhere within it. And you can be virtually assured the New York Times will have that on the front page. And then your poor CEO will have a horrible month trying to deal with the consequences. South Africa is a fundamentally free and open society. It's got a sophisticated banking system. It's got deep and liquid in the relative sense capital markets. And it offers expatriates an absolutely amazing standard of living. Much better on a per dollar basis than what you can have anywhere else in the world. So South Africa is still very, very well positioned to be a gateway into or an exit out of Africa. But it has, of course, of late not done enough to be diplomatic to take advantage of that position. But again, it's where this green shoots reading becomes so important. Are the assembled circumstances becoming such that may change? And if that is the case, its advantages, particularly to Western investors, are so great that it could do extremely well out of that gateway position.
Just bringing it back home a little bit, France, we've had all these commissions of inquiry and corruption trial, investigations, and I think we often see all the news flow and then things fail, nobody goes to jail. But there's some green shoots happening perhaps within the SAPs and some of those investigations, and then I guess saving corruption or reducing corruption means we can spend that money on other value-add services. So how do we rein in corruption? And then further, what are some of the interesting things happening we mentioned the SAPs as well.
Yeah, look, I think there are consequences for corruption. I think early in the post-Zoom administration, in practice, my understanding of it is a view dominated that we mustn't move towards prosecutions. We must move towards, we must assuage public frustrations by pretending to pursue prosecutions. We mustn't actually prosecute anyone because this whole house of cards can come tumbling down. You know, the first senior chap who goes to prison might not go quietly. And goodness knows where this thing, if you start pulling the thread, where it's going to end.
So that's a popular narrative.
That's, yeah. And then from there follows the idea that therefore there were no consequences. No, there was a massive consequence. You lost the election. Because if you're not going to solve the problem on the criminal justice side, the public will start to solve the problem for you by looking at a new administration. That's my point, that the democracy actually works. I think at a certain level there was a consequence. Currently we have General Mkhwanazi, whose revelations are so extraordinary. Now, he's interesting. He's not a political appointee. He was trained in the police college before 1994. He's been a police general in Natal. One can only imagine what it takes to be that and still be alive. He's tough. There have been several inquiries into what he has revealed about the goings-on over recent years, and I couldn't even name them for you because they were all buried so very successfully. This one wasn't. Its revelations are day after day after day. Why is that? One reason for it is there's a huge difference between being a 51% and a 49% party. Your power is very much less, and your ability to control things and the flow of things. And I think that's why he hasn't been shut down. He can't be shut down. One police minister has been suspended. Another one, a former minister, fell from the window of his hotel in Paris. This is having very real consequences. And if it does not lead to prosecutions, the political cost of it will play out further and further. And I have no doubt that the fact that I could tell you that the DA is polling ahead of the ANC in Gauteng has to a extent got something to do with the revelations that Mkhwanazi. So the point is there might not be prosecutions yet, but this time the consequences are much more real than they've previously been. I think also what starts to happen is it's a social thing probably. Is now you get these DA and ANC guys in the government together, and perhaps there's some youngsters who start to think about the future, and you can't rein in what Mkhwanazi has done. You can't stop it. It's every day. It's headlines, and astonishing ones. And then what do? Maybe you say, let's go with this. Let it happen. Yeah. Let it play out. And that might just be for the best. So I think it is. I think there have been consequences from the revelations to date. I think the consequences will continue. I think the consequences are much greater than thinking about them narrowly in terms of prosecutions. And I think the overwhelming tide of what is now emerging is something that is almost unstoppable. And I think there are certainly in the up-and-coming leadership of the country people around now who say, if you can't beat them, let's join them. Let's jump on the bandwagon and say this stuff is totally unacceptable. We need to build a different kind of country and a different kind of society. So I think Mkhwanazi and what he's done is immensely important.
France, we haven't really touched much on the balkanization of society in South Africa. We haven't touched on the maturity of our civic civil societies and how sort of dogged and hard-worn they are, and also what we can rely on them for. But I guess in closing, because we're rapidly running out of minutes, in closing, could you just touch on, particularly with most of our audiences are financial advisors, and their clients are middle income, upper middle class people, and many of us have diversified our assets locally and internationally, but some of us have seen our children immigrate and never come back, and some of us have young kids in school, and I guess it doesn't really matter what color you are these days in South Africa. You're trying to decide, like, is it worth being here?
Okay. Balkanization. This is a term we've started to use a lot. And what it really means is the breakup of an established political order into enclaves that might be a little bit hostile to each other. I've raised a lot of arguments in favor of South Africa working via the GNU, and you should be obviously skeptical of those and test them. And I'll tell you, it's not as sure. I'd say it can work from here. It's perfectly easy to make it work, but maybe it doesn't. If it doesn't work, the GNU, so let's go to this. What happens then? Then what happens is the Union of South Africa breaks up. Now, the Union was established in 1910. It brought the two British colonies and the two Boer republics together and made one unitary state. And that state has survived for only one reason. There was a powerful authority in Pretoria that commanded the attention of South Africa's people, whether democratically after 94 and the ANC's early years of success, or otherwise prior to that. If the GNU does not hold, there will no longer be that kind of authority that commands respect. And as a consequence of that, the Union will fragment, not into the old republics and the two British colonies, but into enclaves. And enclaves will be communities, they could be at quite a scale, where people have appropriated for themselves what were once the functions of the state. And this isn't some prediction, this is looking out of the window and showing what has already occurred. And our argument is that the enclaves are fully sustainable throughout the future, and that nothing can happen in South Africa's future, politically or economically, no matter how rough it gets, that overwhelms the enclave's ability to create a future for the people within the walls. And that's quite a statement to make, but we can substantiate it on this point, that the strength of the enclave is proportional to the weakness of the state. If the state weakens a little bit, you might put a solar panel on your roof. If Transnet weakens a little bit, you might move your freight by road. If the state weakens a lot, you maintain law and order on the streets yourself. Natal. The police abandoned their posts and the state lost complete control, and the private sector and ordinary people, as we all saw those amazing pictures at the time, actually took back control and handed the province back to the government and said, there you go, have another go at it. We've saved you. And it was quite a nice moment at the end of that. I mean, it was a terrible and violent thing, and lots of people died. But where some government officials actually thanked the people and said, thanks for
stepping in,
bailing us out. So my point is that it doesn't matter. Let's say I'm completely wrong on the GNU and it doesn't work and it falls apart into complete disorder and quite high levels of inflation and some political violence. Let's make the worst case we can, printing money, all of that. My case is that for South Africa's middle classes, the enclaves in which they live will strengthen to such an extent that it will virtually guarantee them a permanent presence in the country if they wish to have that. It makes us completely unique to any post-colonial African society to date, where when you got into deep trouble, you had to leave with your money. There wasn't, you had to flee. The sort of imagery older people might remember of the sort of Portuguese forging the river into South Africa in 1974. Our view then, and what we say to our clients is, we now think that if you're quite well off and you wish to, you have a permanent future in the country, and you will live in great splendor, as we tend to, at the cost of it. And you can do that through the unity government perhaps working, but even if it doesn't, you will go back to your enclaves and you live like that. And if you don't have a social conscience and you don't care much about what happens in society around you, you'd probably be completely at ease and have a wonderful time. And the minister will be your neighbour in your walled golf estate or lifestyle estate, or whatever the thing is going to be. And that the collective of these enclaves will be one of the world's most exciting emerging markets. It's not just that you're holding out against the sort of horde that threatens you. You'll actually thrive. And people that can see through macro SA into that will realize the wonderful opportunities here to be successful and to do business and the like. Now, critics of the enclaves say already that they're terrible things. They're sort of bastions of elite privilege and outposts of wealth and the seas of poverty. And that's a fair enough a description, but that's very good, because it means that even if we get into a lot of political trouble, we will keep far more of the entrepreneurial base, the skills base and the tax base inside the country than might otherwise have been the case. And part of the reason why we've got through the Zuma years and the last decade and Natal in such good form is exactly this. You don't have to leave. And in fact, on the balance of things, people must decide what they wish to do. But I think if you weigh it up, there's nowhere in the Western world that will offer you, if you're a fairly well-off person, the standard of living that South Africa offers you today. And as that realization deepens and the understanding of the Balkans deepens, so does the anxiety reduce about who sits in the union buildings in Pretoria. I can remember doing these conversations a few years ago, and whoever was talking to me, their clients might have been terribly worried about who was in Pretoria, because if it was the wrong person, it meant the end, kaput. Doomsday was upon us. We'll all have to sort of swim to the next destination. And I think South Africa's kind of comfortable middle classes are starting to realize that it doesn't actually matter in material terms that much to them. And therefore they have a long-term future here. And that means we can get through even extended periods of real problems, real political problems, real economic problems, because we won't have to go and attract a diaspora from abroad to rebuild the society. We'll keep it here within its fortifications, which is what these things in practice are. They're medieval, walls with guards, and then you kind of, if you live in Johannesburg, you guys have it different here. You kind of run the gauntlet from your sort of paddle club to the golf club and back again, and that's the kind of plight of the middle classes. And so we've got to an interesting position in our own assessment where if you're a middle class person, we don't think there's a precipice anymore. We think that you will, in material terms, your life, if you make the right investment decisions, hedge yourself appropriately and all of that, you're pretty much guaranteed now. If you want to be here, you'll be here for generations, and those generations will, in material terms, live in great splendor.
Frans, I have to thank you, certainly from me and the audience. It's been a remarkable hour and a half spending time hearing some of your insights. And I think what we started the morning by saying, the most expensive words in strategy are, I didn't see that coming. Certainly after the last interview, I don't think any of us have that excuse. And so it has been really enlightening, and thank you so much for being with us.
Well, thank you very much for getting me in.
To the audience, it's been a super hour and a half, and thank you so much for being with us. I'm going to bring the session to a close now and just remind you that we're INN8, we are the advisor's partner, and I wish all of you a safe and peaceful December break. Thank you.
INN8 is a registered trademark of Stanlib Wealth Management Pty Limited, an authorized financial services provider.